cursed as the car lurched, sinking deeper into the mud.
Should have listened to the sheriff.
The rain hammered down, blurring the flooded landscape. They were supposed to be covering the flood, not starring in it. Now their car was belly up in mud, miles from anywhere.
No signal.
They were stuck.
Let's try on foot.
They trudged through the downpour, the muddy water soaking their shoes. It was Doc who spotted it first.
Look,
A cluster of buildings untouched by the flood rising on a small hill. Hope flickered in Frank's chest. They slogged towards the town, each step heavy with exhaustion. As they drew closer, an eerie silence settled over them. No sound of life, no barking dogs, no welcoming lights. It felt deserted, forgotten by time. They reached the first building, a general store with its sign barely clinging to the rotted wood. Frank tried the door. It creaked open as if inviting them in. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and the musty scent of decay. Cobwebs draped the shelves, some holding faded boxes and rusted cans. Behind the counter, a dusty cash register sat frozen in time.
Hello?
His voice echoed in the silence. Only the dripping of water from a hole in the roof answered him. They moved deeper into the store, their footsteps loud in the stillness. A door creaked open, revealing a back room. A table sat in the center, two chairs overturned beside it. Canned goods lined shelves along one wall, and a humidor sat on the table, cigars spilling from its open lid. It was as if someone had simply walked away, leaving everything behind. Frank felt a shiver crawl up his spine. This place was more unsettling than he'd expected.
well, might as well make ourselves at home.
He picked up a can, squinting at the faded label.
Peaches, still good, you think?
Frank shrugged, uneasy. He wasn't sure he wanted to find out. But as Doc used his pocket knife to pry open the can, the smell of sweet peaches filled the air. Suddenly, his stomach rumbled. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clinking of spoons against tin and the occasional drip from the leaky roof. The peaches were surprisingly good, the sweetness a welcome change from the metallic taste of fear that had lingered in Frank's mouth. Doc even found a box of matches and lit two of the cigars. The rich aroma of tobacco filled the air, calming Frank's nerves.
This isn't so bad. Quiet, peaceful.
Frank almost agreed. There was a strange serenity to this abandoned town. It was like stepping into a forgotten world. But the serenity was shattered by a soft thump from the doorway. They both froze, cigars forgotten in their hands. A tiny figure crawled into the room, a baby no more than a year old with wide, curious eyes and a shock of dark hair. It giggled, a high-pitched sound that echoed in the silence, and crawled towards them. Frank stared, his mind struggling to make sense of the impossible. Where had this baby come from? There was no one else around, no sign of any other life in this ghost town. But before he could voice his confusion, another thump echoed from the doorway, then another and another. Dozens of babies, all different ages, but all with the same wide eyes and curious expressions, crawled into the room. They surrounded Frank and Doc, their tiny hands reaching out, their babbling filling the air. Frank felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't right. It wasn't natural. This town held secrets, and he wasn't sure he wanted to know what they were. They spent the night huddled in a corner of the general store, surrounded by a sea of sleeping babies. The silence, when it finally came, was almost as unnerving as the incessant babbling had been. Frank barely slept, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. It was like something out of a Twilight Zone episode. Dawn broke, painting the flooded landscape in shades of grey and pink. Frank stretched, his back stiff from sleeping on the hard floor. He looked at Doc, who was rubbing his eyes and yawning.
What in the blue blazes?
Doc started, then stopped. He stared at Frank, his eyes wide.
Frank, look in the mirror.
Frank stumbled to his feet and grabbed a dusty hand mirror from a shelf. He stared at his reflection. His wrinkles seemed less pronounced, his skin clearer. He looked younger.
It's the country air.
He tried to sound nonchalant, but his voice shook. He'd seen the look on Doc's face, the way his own reflection had startled him. Something was happening, and the country air had nothing to do with it. The babies were awake now, their cries echoing through the store.
We need to find out what's going on here, Doc. Let's explore the town.
Frank and Doc, their unease growing, decided to explore the town. They left the general store and stepped back into the eerie silence. The floodwaters had receded slightly, revealing more of the town. There were houses, a church, even a schoolhouse. all deserted, all silent.
This place gives me the creeps, Frank.
They reached the town square where a fountain stood dry and cracked, or at least it had been dry. Now water bubbled from a newly opened fissure, cascading down its sides in a miniature waterfall, and the water, it shimmered even in the weak sunlight. It sparkled like 1,000 diamonds.
What is that?
Doc breathed, his eyes fixed on the fountain. He took a step closer, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. Frank felt a surge of unease. Something about that water, about this whole town, felt wrong.
Don't.
He said, reaching out to grab Doc's arm, but he was too late. Doc dipped his hand into the water. A gasp escaped his lips.
It's warm.
He whispered, his voice filled with wonder. He cupped his hands and drank deeply. Frank watched in horror, unable to tear his gaze away. Something was happening to Doc. His features were shifting, his body shrinking. The wrinkles on his face disappeared, replaced by the smooth skin of youth. His thinning hair grew thicker, darker.
I don't understand.
Doc stumbled back from the fountain, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked like a teenager, his youthful face a mask of shock. He reached up to touch his cheek, his fingers trembling.
The water, it's the fountain of youth. I've read about it, legends, myths.
Frank stared at him, his mind reeling. He'd seen it with his own eyes, but he still couldn't quite believe it.
We could be young again, Frank. We could have our whole lives ahead of us.
Frank felt a chill run down his spine. The idea was tempting, he couldn't deny that. The aches and pains of age, the regrets and missed opportunities, all of it could be washed away with a single drink. But something held him back. The babies, the deserted town, the eerie silence, it all felt wrong. There had to be a price for this kind of miracle.
Don't you see? This is our chance. We can start over, do everything we always wanted to do. We can travel the world, write that book, fall in love again.
Frank hesitated. Doc was right. This was a chance to rewrite their lives, to erase the mistakes and regrets. And yet...
What about the babies?
What about them?
They're here for a reason. This town, this fountain, it's all connected to them somehow. What if they're trapped here? What if they can't age because of the water?
Doc's face paled. He looked back at the fountain, his youthful enthusiasm draining away.
We can't just leave them.
Frank nodded. He knew, deep down, that they couldn't. They'd stumbled upon something extraordinary, something magical, but also something dangerous. They had a responsibility now, not just to themselves, but to these children. They spent the next few hours gathering food and supplies from the abandoned houses. They found formula and baby food, blankets and toys. They brought everything back to the general store, creating a makeshift nursery. The babies, sensing their intentions, quietened as they worked. Their wide, watchful eyes followed their every move. As Frank looked at the sea of tiny faces, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He didn't understand what had happened, why they were here, but he knew they couldn't just abandon these children. He looked at Doc, who was bottle-feeding a crying infant. The youthful glow had faded from his face, replaced by a look of determination. They were in this together, for better or for worse.
We need to get help. We need to tell someone about this place, about the babies.
Frank nodded. They couldn't keep this a secret forever. But who would believe them? Would they be seen as heroes or as madmen? And what would happen to the babies then? As they discussed their options, a strange sensation washed over Frank. He felt lightheaded, dizzy. He looked down at his hands. They were smaller, chubbier.
Doc, I think it's happening again.
Doc's eyes widened in alarm. He watched as Frank shrank before his eyes, his clothes becoming loose around his shrinking frame. Within moments, Frank was a baby again, his own cries echoing through the store. He reached out blindly, his tiny hand grasping Doc's finger. Doc looked down at Frank, a strange mix of fear and wonder on his face. He knew his own transformation was inevitable. He knelt down, carefully placing Frank amongst the other babies. He gathered a bowl and filled it with the shimmering water from the fountain, placing it within easy reach. As he felt the familiar sensation of his body shrinking, Doc smiled. He was no longer afraid. He was starting over just like all the other children in this strange and wonderful place. He closed his eyes, embracing the unknown. He was a child again, filled with a sense of boundless possibility. The last thing he saw before he drifted off to sleep was a vision of Frank. his eyes wide and curious, reaching out to grab a rattle. They had a second chance, a clean slate. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: they would face it together. And this time, they would do it right. He would make sure of it. He would make sure they lived their lives to the fullest, embracing every moment, every experience, because this time they were young, they were free, and they had all the time in the world.